Hey everybody, this is Meyer, and in this video what I want to do is talk about the standard track controls you see within your digital audio workstation. In particular, when we look at Studio One, I want to talk about in this video what the track controls are for each instrument or audio track and how these relate to the tracks that are present in the mixer when we open up the Mixer tab. So let's go ahead and get started. So if we go back to our demo project, we of course have both an audio track and a MIDI track or an instrument track. If we click on this Mix tab at the bottom, we can actually view the mixer. This is where the digital audio workstation reproduces those mixing consoles or the behavior of those big mixing consoles. So by clicking on that, we can actually see the individual faders, which control the volume of each track. So let's talk about what's similar or what's kind of the correlation between what's going on here at the top and what's going on in this Mixer tab, or the playlist and the mixer. So each one of these mixer tracks corresponds to one of these instrument tracks or channels that we see in the playlist. So, and the colors are pretty much exactly the same. So notice how we have this audio track, which is corresponding to an audio track down here, and we have this synth bass, which is corresponding to the synth bass here. We also have an additional instrument track for this synthesizer called My Tai, which isn't actually available there in the playlist. And this is because not every instrument in Studio One will always have a one-to-one correspondence to a playlist track. Now, this is where things can get a little bit confusing because you can have multiple playlist tracks that have different MIDI information that are sending them all to the same instrument. I could have this instrument that's there in my project, My Tai, but notice how here it's grayed out because it's not being used. But at the same time, I could also have multiple of these instrument tracks or MIDI tracks that are all sending their instrument or note data directly to the same synthesizer. And those would be like different layers. So maybe you want to have, for some reason, you want to have a bass part being played and a mid part and a high part, and you want those to be on separate lanes so you can see them separately, but they're all triggering the same synthesizer. That's why you don't exactly see this one-to-one correspondence. But in general, whenever you create an audio track, or you create an instrument track that contains a specific instrument, each one will have its own associated mixer track automatically created for you. So let's take a look at what's in each track when we look at it in the playlist. So we have the track name here, which can be changed by double-clicking on it. You also have the track color, which can be just helpful for organizing things. I like to have a system where I color and name things in a specific way that's consistent, so when I look at my project, I know exactly where everything is. You're also presented here with the volume or level of the track. So this white bar is pretty much the volume. And when you mouse over it, you'll actually see the value in dB or dB full scale that this track is being played back at. You also have the track's instrument. So if you're using an instrument or MIDI track, it'll show the track's instrument there if that instrument exists. Granted, if you're using an audio track, that's not going to show up at all. And you may have multiple of these lanes, as we talked about earlier, that correspond to different instruments or the same instrument depending on what you're looking for. So generally in Studio One, every time you add an instrument, it'll be a unique version of it. So if I wanted to add another version of Presence which loads a different instrument, a different track may have Presence number 2 on it. So these are all going to be unique different instruments. Whereas if you want them to be triggering the same instrument, you have to go in there and select which instrument this MIDI track is particularly targeting. So once again, if you remember in the last video, we talked about the distinction between audio and MIDI. Remember that all the MIDI track does is play back MIDI information and send it to the particular instrument. So if there's no instrument there, there's going to be no sound because that MIDI isn't triggering any instrument, which is going to take that MIDI information and translate it into sound in the mixer stage. You also have this button here, which will open the virtual instrument for editing. So if you have a MIDI track, and let's just in this case where we have Presence, this keyboard icon lets us know that it's a virtual instrument, and clicking that button will actually open up the virtual instrument for us to edit and change the sound that's there. So once again, that instrument is the actual device that's taking that MIDI information and translating it to sound. So editing that virtual instrument will change the sound that's being created as the MIDI notes are triggering it. Over here, we have the mute button, which when it's enabled, the track will not play audio, but everything else will. So if you think about, just muting, it's just basically telling that particular track to be silent. Whereas solo kind of does the opposite. When you hit the solo button, what will happen is only the soloed tracks will play. So if none of the other tracks are soloed and you click the solo button, only this track, the synth bass, will play and none of the other ones will. Then over here you have the record arm button. So by clicking this red button, it will actually record when you hit the master record button. So this isn't actually a record button for this track. All it does is arm the track ready for recording. And then when you hit the big record button in the transport control, it'll start recording the information to whatever tracks are armed. So once again, if it's a MIDI track, arming that for recording and then clicking the big record button will actually record MIDI information from any MIDI instrument you have, like a keyboard or something like that. And if it's an audio track, arming an audio track for recording and then clicking the record button will actually cause that audio track to record audio directly into that audio track. But it has to be armed for that big record button to work. That means you can arm multiple things at once. So let's say you wanted to record yourself singing and playing a virtual instrument like a piano. You could arm both your microphone and your piano track for recording, hit the record button, and then you can play them both at the same time and record them both. So that's why you need to arm each individual track before you hit the record button. And then next to it, you have the monitor icon, which just basically lets you know, are you hearing, are you able to preview this track through your headphones or through the master speakers? This can be helpful if you're trying to record your voice and you want to actually hear yourself back through your headphones in context with the rest of the track. So that's what that blue speaker icon does. It's just a monitoring button. Likewise, if we consider those track controls, we actually have a lot very similar controls here on the mixer channel. So here we have this 303 BOW, and it's being sent to this presence instrument. And notice how over here, this mixer track is actually corresponding to that above channel track. So in this demo, we only have one track. It's an instrument or a MIDI track, but the same would be true if it was an audio track. And let's look at the common features between them. So we have mute, which down here, this is the same button as the mute button above, and solo, once again, the same button. So clicking this will toggle it either way. You also have your track volume and meter. So in this case, you actually get a virtual fader as opposed to that little white bar you see up above. And of course, record arm. This is the same button that we saw above as well. So they're both enabled in this case. We also have the same button to open the virtual instrument if this corresponding mixer track is corresponding to a virtual MIDI or instrument track. Then we have our panning knob and our meter. And this button over here, which will open the effects panel. Now, this is something that's in particular to the mixer where you can add effects directly to your audio. And what effects do is they basically take the audio, change it in some way, and output an audio. So if you remember our distinction between VSTIs and VSTs last week, that's kind of the idea here. A VSTI would be the instrument that takes the MIDI information and outputs audio, whereas a VST or standard effects, which VSTs are a subset of, these are the actual devices that take in audio, do some change to it, and output audio. Thanks for watching, and hopefully this has been helpful for you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Don't forget to check out that Discord, and once again, ask any questions, but Discord's probably the best place to ask those questions because we'll be checking that more regularly. See ya.